Hello. Good afternoon, everyone. And please just get seated. I know more students and more folks are joining us. So good afternoon, everybody on the room, and to those on Zoom. Good morning, good afternoon, or good evening, wherever you are. My name is Amani Al-Jack, and on behalf of the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights, it's my pleasure to welcome you all. Today's talk by Sarah Ihmoud is being run as a hybrid event with a live audience at UMass, as well as participants from around the world who are joining us on Zoom. This is the second event of the Consortium Fall Speaker Series, which is organized in collaboration with the Department of Women's, Gender, and Sexuality Studies grant, Mellon Grant, Affirming Multifocal Humanities. I'd like to thank the Consortium Director, Carol Cohn, as well as the Consortium Program Associate, Claire Hendrick, and the Consortium interns who have put so much work into organizing this event and the rest of the series. I would also like to thank the co-sponsors of today's event, including, and we have a long list of people to thank here, the Office of the Provost and Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs, the McCormick Grad School of Policy and Global Studies, the Honors College, the Office of Global Programs, the Student Multicultural Affairs, and also thank the Departments of Latino Studies, Sociology, Political Science, Conflict Resolution, Human Security, and Global Governance. But also thanks Asian Studies Department. We are also very pleased that today's event by event is part of the Islamic World Lecture Series. Before I introduce our speaker, I would like to say something about the location of where this event is taking place. As many of you already know, UMass Boston and its surrounding communities are based on the unceded homeland of Massachusetts, Potwick, and Nubwik people. The way the land was passed from indigenous to non-indigenous people has been through a violent history of genocide, forced removal, violent trauma, death, dispossession. All these processes remain to be happening in different parts of the US and around the globe. We would like to emphasize that land acknowledgement by themselves are not enough, but it's only one step to acknowledging and supporting indigenous communities. And that support is not only words, but needs to be followed by action, building solidarity, and also supporting the land back movement. So as people are still being seated here, I would like to talk a little bit about the structure of today's event. Dr. Ihmoud talk, after Dr. Ihmoud talk, she will take questions from both the people here in the room as well as the Zoom folks. For those of you who are in the room, the kind of the Q&A part of our series is changed a little bit this time in order to allow more questions to be collected from the audience and for the questions to be addressed. So we're asking you, you'll find that there are some index cards on your chairs. Please make sure that you write your answers. You write your questions, and if you don't mind, mention your name, and also that way we'll be able to group them and forward them to Dr. Ihmoud at the end of the talk. Just one friendly note, please make sure that your handwriting is clear enough for us to be able to read these questions and pass them along. For those who are joining us on Zoom, the Q&A part of Zoom is now open and will continue throughout the event. We encourage those who are joining us via Zoom to write their names and introduce themselves as well as they write their questions. 'Cause, 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 The Q&A part of Zoom will kind of resume after the lecture. At the end of the lecture, a short pop-up survey will appear on Zoom, and we encourage those to take the time to write their surveys. Similarly, for those here, you'll find that there are surveys as part of the packages on your chairs. Please also take the time at the end of the event to answer these surveys. For everybody, we just want to make sure that you know that this event is recorded and is going to be posted to the consortium website as well as to our YouTube channel. All right, so it is now my great pleasure to introduce to you our very distinguished speaker today. We are so excited to have you with us, Sarah, here. Sarah Ihmoud is an assistant professor of anthropology at the College of Holy Cross in Worcester, Massachusetts. Her research interest lies at the intersection of transnational feminism, women of color, theory, indigenous and decolonial feminisms, critical race studies, and Middle East and Arab American studies. Drawing upon these fields, her research theorizes as the racialization of Palestinian women in Palestine and the diaspora, transnational Palestinian feminism, and Palestinian feminist epistemologies. Dr. Ihmoud's scholarship has been published in American Anthropologist, Feminist Anthropology, Cultural Anthropology, Feminist Studies, State Crime Journal, Jerusalem Quarterly, and Biography. Oh, impressive kind of record of publication here. Her current book in progress is entitled Al-Maqdasiyya, Palestinian Feminism and the Decolonial Imaginary. The book is a feminist ethnography centering Palestinians' women resistance to colonial and patriarchal violence in the occupied East Jerusalem. The book asks how a critical feminist lens reshapes our understanding of Israel, settler colonialism, Palestinian liberation, and decolonization. She's a founding member of Palestinian Feminist Collective and an executive board member of Insaniyyat, which translates to humanities. The society, she's also a member of the Society of Palestinian Anthropologists. Her talk today is entitled Counter-Reproductive Genocide in Gaza, Palestinian Women's Testimonies. It's high time we have somebody to address the question of Palestinian here at UMass Person and reflecting on people's lived experiences and your own experience. So it's really quite an honor to have you here. Thank you. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Ihmoud.
For that incredibly generous and warm introduction. And thank you all for having me today in Mass Boston. It's an honor to be with you. I'd like to extend my gratitude as well, especially to the Consortium on Gender, Security, and Human Rights, all of the co-sponsors that were named, and the organizers of this event, especially Professor Carol Cohn and Claire Kendrick, for making space for this conversation on Palestine in this critical moment in our liberation struggle. It's an honor to be here with you all today. The title of my talk today is Countering Reproductive Genocide in Gaza, Palestinian Women's Testimonies. And I want to add my gratitude to my colleagues at Birzeit University's Institute for Women's Studies, in particular its director, Dr. Rania Jawad, who shared initially these testimonies that the Institute has been gathering since October 2023, which are the basis of my talk today. And I want to note, oh, okay, is this better? And thank you. And I want to note that all of the slides have been also prepared by the Institute for Women's Studies, and that the photographs that appear alongside women's testimonies or the excerpts therein are actual photographs taken by the women themselves. So as you explore the testimonies and take a look at the photographs, you can consider that, right, these are the actual lived experiences of women on the ground who are surviving genocide in this moment. It is hard to remember the last morning when my heart was at peace. Mornings have been terrifying since October 7th. Everything changed that day. Now, rather than exchanging good mornings with loved ones, I quickly reach for my phone, my heart whispering a prayer for the telecom network to still be up. In a flurry of anxious anticipation mixed with fear, I rush to check on the rest of my family first. We are now dispersed in different areas within an already small area. Then, if fortune allows and the service persists, I check on my friends and relatives. Sometimes their replies soothe my heart. Other times, it breaks my heart to learn of the martyrdom of someone near. A relative, friend, colleague, acquaintance, academic instructors, or mentors. The news is heaviest and most horrific when I hear of the martyrdom of an entire family. That feeling I cannot describe to you as it defies words. These are the words of Bara Hamoudah, a Palestinian woman from Beit Lahia, Gaza, shared via a WhatsApp message with colleagues at Birzeit University in the occupied West Bank on November 11th, 2023. Bara's words speak to the particular ways that Palestinian women name and understand state violence and its gendered effects in this moment. As she described the terrifying new reality that she and 2 million Palestinians held captive in the occupied Gaza Strip awoke to since October 7th, her words focused on the dismembering of the Palestinian social body, the dispersal of her family, the fear and anticipation in attempting to reconnect, even momentarily, when facing the bombardment of Israeli airstrikes and the feeling of intense grief that is beyond words. Quote, I heard the whimpers of the wounded who were buried under the rubble of their homes, trapped for hours, awaiting their fate with nobody to dig them out due to the dire lack of equipment and machinery for rescue. Their cries haunt me at night, and I find myself wishing that I could go back to them, sit by them, and console them, even if only with my words. I saw beautiful ancient sites turn to ruins, and I saw the schools, universities, institutions, and training centers that shaped me as a person razed to the ground. I don't know what awaits us after tomorrow, she wrote in a final message on November 15th. Our hope is in God alone, and we resign ourselves into his hands. Bara's words invite us to listen deeply to the myriad forms of violence Palestinian women in Gaza are living and anticipating day by day. How are Palestinian women in Gaza choosing to document and narrate this moment? What do Palestinian women's stories teach us about the embodied, lived dimensions of surviving genocide? What do they move us towards, and what do they invite us to understand and to practice? Indigenous feminist scholars have long emphasized that telling women's stories, quote, facilitates an understanding of broader socio-political and historical dynamics, end quote. While Palestinian women's narratives have often been subordinated to men's authority to represent history, traditional gender roles and boundaries were interrupted by the Nakba and life in exile, allowing women to gain increasing recognition as authoritative narrators of the Palestinian story. My talk today explores women's ways of experiencing and narrating the ongoing genocide in Gaza. It centers the oral and written words, voice memos, poetic fragments, social media posts, and other materials collected, transcribed, and translated by colleagues at Birzeit University's Institute for Women's Studies as part of a project on women's, quote, testimonials of genocide. Women's stories of surviving genocide give voice to a matrix of settler colonial violence and its gendered effects, from starvation to the violation of women's bodies during the time of birth, to witnessing mass killings and experiences of multiple forced displacements, to the intimacies of caretaking, grief, and mourning, an indictment of the cruel world that has regarded Palestinian women as killable and expendable subjects. following Palestinian women's own naming. I theorize this matrix of gendered colonial violence as ibada, Arabic for annihilation, which refers to the annihilation of the Palestinian collective. Ibada names extermination of the Palestinian people as the central imperative of Zionist colonialism in Gaza and beyond, at the same time that it understands it to be a dynamic and multifaceted infrastructure of multiple and intersecting forms of gendered violence, from the destruction of Palestinian home spaces and multiple forced displacements to the targeting of Palestinian women's safety and ability to access basic needs during the time of birth, from the targeted killing of entire families and dismemberment of the Palestinian social body to deliberate starvation, from the destruction of hospitals and medical facilities to the targeting of children and their very bodies, from mass incarceration and systematized sexual violence by Israeli forces to the assault on Palestinian universities, schools, teachers, and indigenous knowledge systems. Palestinian women's stories highlight the calculated infliction of these multiple and intersecting forms of physical and psychological terror, pain, suffering, and complex forms of loss onto the Palestinian gendered body and collective as intertwined with dehumanization, territorial dispossession, and the destruction of indigenous ways of being in the world. While I do not have the space to explore the full scope of Ibada here, I focus on three central and interconnected aspects of this genocidal power structure: gendered terror and the birthing Palestinian body, forced displacement and mass killing, and the infliction of complex and continuous forms of loss. Drawing on Palestinian women's testimonies and their own embodied and affective analysis, I argue that Israel's genocidal project, hypervisible now in the intensification of warfare against the occupied and besieged Gaza Strip, but also unfolding across occupied Palestinian territory for the last 76 years, should be understood centrally as a reproductive genocide, an attempt to prevent the reproduction of present and future generations of Palestinian lives. Amidst this tapestry of grief and loss, Palestinian women's stories narrate a collectively forged vocabulary of survival that contests reproductive genocide. Moreover, their own writing and sharing their stories publicly must be understood as an inherently political act that contests colonial structures and discourses, including those of hegemonic Western feminisms, that render our collective experiences as Palestinian women invisible. If this moment illustrates the remobilization of colonial feminism to justify and collude with Israel's genocidal project, it also invites a reinvigorated global anti-colonial feminist politics anchored in the vigorous opposition of war and an indigenous affirmation of life in Gaza, Palestine, and beyond. Over the last 395 days and counting, Israel has killed over 44,000 Palestinians in Gaza, an estimated 70% of whom are women and children, with the United Nations highlighting the killing of 2 mothers per hour. A study by The Lancet published in June 2024 estimates that Israel has killed up to 186,000 Palestinians when accounting for the indirect causes of Palestinian death that have resulted from Israel's military invasion. The devastation of Gaza's infrastructure, healthcare systems, the imposition of food and water shortages, and the lack of shelter and medicine. Even if the war were to end today, Palestinians will face, quote, indirect consequences, such as reproductive, communicable, and non-communicable diseases for years to come. Israel has displaced more than 1.9 million people in Gaza, 85% of the total population, with most families experiencing multiple forced displacements, including an estimated 1 million women and girls. Indescribable insomnia. I don't recall ever having a moment of deep sleep or relief since October 7th. Panic, fear, anxiety are all what I feel, to the extent that my blood pressure drops to 80/50. I don't feel up to eat, work, or study. I go out and walk the street in order to forget, but in vain. Literally and without exaggeration, I am holding onto my phone 24/7. Nonstop attempts to call. I swear, sometimes it takes 100 tries before the line goes through, and I hear my father's voice saying, my daughter, we are still alive. And my mother saying, take care of yourself and your brother until we see each other again. I end the call and collapse. The news that we hear and see of killing, destruction, displacement, hunger, lack of basics for hygiene and food is unprecedented, nor have we lived through it before in our lives, writes Shata Jaber Ismail Karmout on December 11th, 2023. Shata had been separated from her family throughout the intensification of Israel's latest genocidal assault and was now watching from Cairo. At the beginning of the calamity, she said, I thought people were exaggerating the news until my sister, Dr. Hana, who I trust more than myself, said, quote, Shata, we are in Al-Shati refugee camp and the bombing is everywhere and there is no bread or water. Whether we leave or we stay, we will die of hunger and thirst. She continued, my sister Hana and her husband, Dr. Ahmed, delivered babies in houses in Al-Shati camp amidst the bombing, destruction, and terror, and without any tools or equipment. As she quoted her sister's experience, quote, we only have hot water, and the umbilical cord is cut with a sharp, unsterilized knife because there is no gas to sterilize it, and there is no opportunity even to light a fire to sterilize it. It is beyond the limits of our imagination, end quote. Indeed, the mass starvation of Gaza's population increases each day due to unceasing Israeli bombardment and the restrictions on humanitarian access, with Israeli settlers actively blocking trucks carrying desperately needed food and medical supplies. With food insecurity reaching unprecedented levels, women and girls are expected to be hit the hardest as, quote, women tend to vastly deprioritize their food intake when access to food is restricted. Pregnant and lactating women are at even higher health and malnutrition risks, not only to themselves, but also to their babies. In spite of the distinct vulnerabilities faced by Palestinian women, gender-specific services, as with all other services, have been severely disrupted, with the only functional maternity hospital in northern Gaza expected to run out of fuel imminently. And I believe that this particular hospital is actually the hospital that has been under military assault over the last several days, where we've seen reports of pregnant women on the way to deliver their babies being literally shot and left to bleed out on the hospital grounds, and hospital patients, including infants in the NICU, being forcibly evicted by Israeli military authorities. Like the babies Shata's sister delivered without tools or equipment in a refugee camp, an estimated 5,500 women are expected to give birth in Gaza in the next month, of whom 840 are likely to experience pregnancy or birth-related complications, needing additional care that is simply not available. Medical experts point to the fact that the consequences of Israel's targeting of Palestinian women's ability to give birth safely will be intergenerational. As leading medical expert and surgeon, Dr. Hussein Abu Sitta reminds us, early on, during the invasion of Al-Shifa Hospital in November 2023, Israel dropped white phosphorus bombs on the maternity ward. It destroyed the largest IVF facility in Gaza. There is no access to pre- or postnatal care. Healthcare workers report a 300% increase in the miscarriage rate among pregnant women in Gaza since Israel's attacks began in October, as the lack of supplies due to ongoing bombardment and blockade has made the conditions of carrying healthy pregnancies exceedingly difficult. Stillbirth and maternal mortality rates have also risen dramatically. These immediate outcomes are necessarily interwoven with more permanent medical conditions. Mothers starved of the caloric intake they need during the time of birth bear children who are underweight. Children born underweight grow to be adults that are more susceptible to non-communicable diseases, an increased risk in brain damage, and more, illustrating how the ecology of war is inflicted as an intergenerational assault on Palestinian life. Maryam Mansour-Allah is one of the 50,000 women who have given birth recently in such conditions. She was forced to leave her home in Beit Lahia in northern Gaza at the beginning of the war during her 6 months of pregnancy. Quote, I entered my 7th month of pregnancy while in a tent in one of the makeshift shelters, she wrote on January 12, 2024. And with the great stress, lack of cleanliness, lack of resources, food and water, it was extremely tiring, end quote. Miriam's testimony highlights the gendered labor of navigating the everyday life of displacement and terror, intensified by the labor of caring and nurturing Palestinian life. Quote, I had to walk a long distance to reach the bathroom and then wait in line for around an hour and sometimes more than an hour to use the bathroom. I reached the point that I lost the ability to walk, and I experienced all labor symptoms while in my 7th month. So I was forced to return to Gaza City so that I could stay at my aunt's house and rest because of the intense pain. But the severity of the bombing, the siege, and the lack of food and water reached the point where I had to feed my children rotten bread in Gaza, which led me to go back through the Israeli army checkpoint to walk in front of their tanks, jeeps, and snipers under the planes and bombings and past the corpses thrown on the road in order to reach the tent shelters in the south again. My suffering started again, and I entered my 8th month with pain and fatigue, anemia, insomnia, difficulty breathing, and fear of giving birth prematurely, end quote. Miriam's testimony highlights the fact that it is not just the protracted denial of medical care, food, and daily essentials that endangers women's ability to nurture and care for Palestinian life. The destruction of Gaza's infrastructure, coupled with forced displacement and the militarization of neighborhoods, enhances the everydayness of social suffering. Quote, I started to count the days I would enter my 9th month and near the end of my pregnancy, she wrote. Thank God, I entered my 9th month of pregnancy, but a new suffering began, searching for clothes for the baby. Alongside my responsibility already for 2 children, I have to wash their clothes by hand and bathe them in cold water because we don't find heated water. We cook over a fire, and there's great suffering in providing food, water, and bread. It all comes with suffering. Our days are nearly wasted from morning until night as we search for water, work to light a fire, cook, wash clothes, and knead bread. And not to mention the tenfold increase in prices for goods, the lack of any income for most families, and the discontinuation of essential goods in the shops. I've written these words in a tent as I'm in pain and near the end of my pregnancy, waiting to give birth in any moment. How will this child live like so many children who were born in tents and makeshift shelters? End quote. In her final words, Miriam highlights that the suffering she and her children have been forced to endure is not an individual suffering, but a collective one. What will become of her and her newborn child, of her children's futures? Her voice, which seems to be a call to a wider collective, could be any of our grandmothers' voices during the Nakba. While devastating in its invitation to witness the intimacies of survival and mothering in the midst of genocide, it is also a powerful testament to the intergenerationality of Palestinian survival. Indigenous feminist scholars in various global contexts, including Palestine, argue that reproductive violence is at the center of settler colonial attempts to eliminate Native communities. Ibadah must be understood as a structure of gendered violence that operates centrally through an assault on Palestinian reproductive autonomy. As in other settler colonial contexts, Palestinian women's bodies and sexualities have historically been rendered less valuable because of what they are taken to represent: land, reproduction, indigenous kinship, and governance, the possibility of Palestinian sovereignty and future. Settler colonial ideologies of gender and race that construct indigenous women as the inevitable subjects of gendered violence and control continue to undergird the ongoing occupation and dispossession of Native people, from the Americas to occupied Palestine. Still, in this moment, Palestinian women show how even when humanity has failed, we continue to birth our people. We continue to create and nurture Palestinian life on our homeland, in spite of genocide, leading toward the futures we urgently need and so courageously desire. Forced displacement and mass killing. The Zionist assault on Palestinian reproductive autonomy is interwoven with a variety of other factors that together attempt to prevent the intergenerational capacity to reproduce the Palestinian social body. Palestinian women's testimonies highlight the immense precarity of women's lives in this moment, characterized not only by mass starvation and the violation of birthing women's bodies and lives, but also by multiple forced displacements and the mundane witnessing of death and suffering that punctuates daily life. Speaking to these issues on November 11th, 2023, Haya Abdulrahman Abu Nasser wrote, quote, "The fragility of our existence became glaringly clear as I narrowly escaped 2 brushes with death. The first occurred in response to imminent threats from the Israeli military. Seeking safety, my family and I hastily relocated from our residence in the northern region of Al-Saftawi Street in Gaza to the southern zone, following the directives of the Israeli military. Just 2 days after our arrival at my uncle's home in Al-Nusrat camp in the southern part of the strip, the adjacent house faced a terrifying bombardment. The aftermath revealed a grim scene of lifeless bodies, blood, and severed limbs strewn across the streets. 30 of our neighbors seeking refuge met a tragic end, ensnared in a difficult fate they sought to escape. Forced to move again, my entire family sought refuge in Khan Yunis at my grandparents' home. However, tragedy struck once more as the Israeli military committed another massacre, destroying a residential square and claiming the lives of more than 50 individuals. We had to relocate once more, this time to the UN Training Center in Khan Yunis, which opened its doors as a refuge for over 30,000 people," end quote. Haya's grim story of escaping death, witnessing the aftermath of a massacre of Palestinian families trying to escape and being forced to seek refuge multiple times amidst spiraling terrorization by Israeli forces, illustrates that there is no safe place for women to flee. Indeed, a recent UN press release raised alarm over the, quote, "deliberate targeting and extrajudicial killing of Palestinian women and children in places where they sought refuge or were fleeing," end quote. Indeed, the majority of the population of Gaza has been forcibly displaced on foot multiple times. The violent uprooting of forced displacement not only breaks apart Palestinian kinships and social networks, it also exacerbates indigenous people's vulnerability to other forms of violence and suffering. Since the Israeli ground invasion began in Gaza, thousands of Palestinians have been arrested and subjected to what human rights groups term systematized forms of torture, including centrally gendered and sexual humiliation, rape, and forced disappearance. According to media reports, Palestinian women and girls, including infants and elderly women, also face severe sexual harassment, detention, and rape by Israeli forces while on the displacement journey. A recent report by the Gaza Community Mental Health Program notes that, quote, "most of the female prisoners, after being subjected to the experience of strip searches in front of people, have lost the ability to communicate visually with people, and their view of themselves became negative." That is, after experiencing severe and continuous psychological terror by Israeli military forces while in detention, many women are unable to look other people in the eye anymore because of the extreme shame and grief that they're experiencing on a continuous level. One mental health professional recounts, quote, "a case of a woman's displacement from Gaza to the south and her exposure to a harsh experience while crossing the Israeli army checkpoints, where she saw one of the soldiers shoot a young man and kill him in front of her. She screamed as a result, so the Israeli army pulled her out from among the people, took off her clothes completely, blindfolded her, and beat her and verbally abused her using obscene words in front of people on the Salahuddin Road," end quote. Further concern has been raised over the disappearance of Palestinian children who reportedly went missing after contact with the Israeli army in Gaza. According to one press release, quote, "there are disturbing reports of at least one female infant forcibly transferred by the Israeli army into Israel, and of children being separated from their parents whose whereabouts remain unknown," end quote. Indeed, a recent report by Save the Children International notes that thousands of Palestinian children are missing. Many children have been, quote, detained and disappeared by Israeli military forces. Some have been thrown into unmarked or mass graves or maimed beyond recognition. Others have been separated from their families and caregivers at risk of exploitation, end quote. In addition, the Zionist state's forcible separation of Palestinian children from their parents, resulting from military strikes, and their killing and incarceration of children devastates mothers and caregivers while denying them the capacity to parent in safety and dignity. Violence against children, resulting in death or the devastation of mental and physical health, places intensifying burdens on mothers and caregivers. The now more than 25,000 orphaned Palestinian children, that is Palestinian children without any surviving relatives, right? 25,000 orphaned Palestinian children, also intensifies the burdens placed on non-biological caregivers who are primarily women. As in other colonial and conflict contexts, the assault on indigenous ecologies of life and relations of care, including familial and communal structures, leads to widespread social issues within indigenous collectives themselves, including an intensification of patriarchal violence and the abuse of those most vulnerable. Mental health care providers in Gaza highlight the prevalence of what they call complex traumas with behavioral effects. The, quote, frequency of violence in all its forms increased, especially domestic violence represented by harm, beating, deprivation, and obscene words, end quote. Further, mental health care professionals providing care to those in Gaza stress that, quote, children live in a state of endless tragedy as they are fragile and vulnerable as a group and have a complete inability to protect themselves from Israeli attacks on the one hand and family and societal attacks on the other hand, end quote. Children too have been forced to become caregivers and support their families in survival efforts, robbing them of their childhood, including their rights to play and learn, with, quote, tasked with, quote, bringing food from charitable spaces, filling water into heavy containers, and carrying it on their weak bodies, standing in line for long hours to register relief requests, or searching for wood, cartons, and everything possible to start a fire for cooking and baking bread, end quote. Continue to attest to some of these dynamics, highlighting the devastation experienced by Palestinian families on the displacement journey. She writes, displaced, we sought shelter in flimsy tents, the embodiment of our fragile hopes. Yet these shelters, like scattered dreams, crumbled under the relentless assault of rain. Children cried, mothers pleaded, and the heavens seemed indifferent. Now we lack proper clothing to ward off the cold. The displacement, initially thought to be brief, has stretched beyond 43 days. Bags initially packed for a temporary escape must now sustain us into an extended nomadic existence. The sky, once a symbol of a cleansing rain, now weeps alongside us, a bitter accomplice in our displacement, end quote. The sky weeps alongside us. Haya's words illustrate not only the extreme suffering and desperation of mothers and their children seeking refuge, but also the immense psychological toll of loss and grief, a pain that is felt viscerally at the level of the soul. Her testimony continues, quote, talks of a truce with no progress have persisted and hope has nearly vanished. The pain we endure seems beyond consolation, especially after the Jabalia massacre claimed the lives of more than 20 of our extended family members. Bitterness gnaws at our souls as we long for the simplicity of a modest home, warmth, a cup of coffee, and the melody of life. Once vibrant markets are now desolate. Children suffer from malnutrition, and the cold becomes an unforgiving adversary. However, we cling to hope, fragile as a gossamer thread, yearning for the respite of a ceasefire or even a momentary uncertain humanitarian pause. We whisper a prayer to return home, hoping our houses are not entirely destroyed. The frustration is palpable as the specter of 1948 haunts us, end quote. Haya's words connect the violence she has experienced and witnessed with the genocidal acts that attempt to impede the survival of a collective body, its distinct ways of being, and its understanding of the world. Haunted by what she calls the specter of 1948, Haya locates Israel's genocidal violence not as an aberration, but as a continuation of the Nakba, a historical continuum of colonial wounding and collective pain. She continues, quote, "We used to hold the belief that our collective struggle would lead to the recognition of our quest for freedom and the hope that the world would condemn the perpetrators and honor the grievances of the oppressed. In the midst of our tears, a peculiar blend of pride, fear, and hope, we dared to dream that the world would listen to our stories and recognize our unwavering determination to stand up against oppression, injustice, and the pervasive sense of impotence. In our naivete, we dared to dream that the United Nations would acknowledge our shared humanity, affirm our territorial rights, and endorse our pursuit of repatriation and life. However, within less than 24 hours, our idealism gave way to a stark realization. We had been cast as the perpetrators. The voices of power, driven by economic interests and political expediency, resonated far more loudly than our collective plea for justice. Bereft of powerful allies, we found ourselves transformed into the accused rather than the accuser," end quote. Haya's words are an indictment of the global political economy that consigns and enables Palestinian suffering and death on a mass scale. Yet they are also testament to the endurance, nonetheless, of women's desires to preserve Palestinian presence in Gaza. Amidst the cries, prayers, and lamentations, she writes, our voices go unheard. Yet we stand vigilant, guarding the dwindling embers of dreams and the flicker of hope that refuses to abandon us. My yearning persists for that seaside cafe where the sound of rain once signified solace, not misery, end quote. The waging of complex and continuous loss. Women's testimonies describe the intensity of grief that comes with the loss of broader ecologies of home. On December 18th, 2023, Fatima Bashir wrote, quote, "Thursday is Miriam's birthday, December 21st. We used to say that in December, the dreams of the people in misery would come to an end and ours would begin. We had agreed to meet on the morning of her birthday and take a day off from work. I used to tell her, imagine if a war started and I would have to go to work on the news. We had agreed to buy fresh sesame bread from the man at the seaport and then go down to the sea, take our shoes off, walk, breathe in the cold air like we love to do. We would buy tea with mint and talk for a long time. We had agreed to blow out your birthday candle and renew our vow of friendship. But I don't know what happened. They killed Miriam. They killed the man who sold the fresh sesame bread. They destroyed the seaport. Gaza is gone and I am left alone. I cry alone. I say goodbye to everything alone. May you be on the river of paradise, letting your hair down, breathing clean air in the shade of God's trees, my dear. I don't know what to write to you. I hope I won't be long. I love you," end quote. Fatima's reflections on the loss of her friend Miriam are deeply intertwined with the loss of the world that she once knew, an entire social tapestry of human and more than human life that has been destroyed. Not only Miriam, but the man who sold the fresh sesame bread, the seaport, the very relationship with the sea, an indigenous fabric of belonging and way of life. Woven together as a tapestry of grief and shared in the midst of collective loss that is still ongoing, I think with Mesli Aguilera to name Gaza as a grieving geography, a space of, quote, complex loss due to multiple interconnected forms of violence, end quote. Like Fatima's expression that Gaza is gone and I am left alone. Like Fatima's expression that, quote, Gaza is gone and I am left alone. Throughout their testimonies, the feelings of Gaza's women are overwhelmingly expressed as feelings of grief and abandonment. and ontological loneliness. As Dua Badawi wrote on October 31st, 2023, quote, "We are fine, thanks to the world that grants us choices, choices between swift and slow death, between dying of thirst or of hunger, dying in grief over memories destroyed with every street, the details of which you have memorized, or for a house that you lived in for years that was turned into ashes, between the death of your loved ones one by one, or being erased from existence along with all from your lineage. Perhaps in the end, you survive with half a body, half a soul, half a heart. Thanks to the humanitarian efforts so that we experience displacement and forced migration over and over again. Thanks to the world that draws inspiration from our death, producing texts, poetry, and slogans that resonate. Thanks to the world that, until the last breath, watches and observes the scenes of walls collapsing on our heads. Thanks to the world that sips its morning coffee as usual, smokes its cigarette, and writes about our steadfastness in the face of the massacre. The same world that still has the energy to contemplate the remains of children, count their numbers, prays, and implores God to grant us victory. By the way, how many did they count? I no longer count, for this is the task of the world. Our task is to contemplate this amount of death and to believe it, that the world we once knew was past, and we are in the midst of a new world, a world of our own, end quote. The resonance of this phrase, the world we once knew was past, and we are in the midst of a new world, speaks to the notion of our grief as an affective force that allows us to travel across space and time. Our feeling, our knowing that we are thrust into a future world that is only ours, as Dua highlighted, yet relegated into the tunnels of the dead, dismembered and discounted. To be so discounted in the world of the human, we are counted only under God's image and in the realm of the spirit. If the intergenerational is always also the spiritual, then our persistence is always also our spirituality. Our grief, gendered and impossible at the same time, requires us to collapse, to pray, and to hold our victory as we hold our grief. It is only by a vastness of spirit that we can still find a way to feel. Dua's words hold an immense sense of grief for the world that has been lost, along with a deep sense of abandonment by world leaders, abandonment by those who continue to go on living, those who produce, quote, texts, poetry, and slogans that resonate on the back of Palestinian suffering, the world that, quote, writes about our steadfastness in the face of the massacre, end quote. These sentiments are echoed in a final poem shared by the poet Maryam Hejazi just before she was martyred by Israeli occupation forces on October 18th, 2023. The women of my land weave their stories for the TV cameras. A journalist with his camera steals the blush from her cheeks, the whistle of her voice. He says that he has some candies. Who wants a piece of gum? Our stories transform into chewed candies, spit out onto the street when done. This is how the stories of women are told, in between sidewalks and alleys, a bedtime story. Dua and Maryam remind us that while uplifting women's stories of ibadah speak out against the invisibility of Palestinian women's grief and suffering, an invisibility that has been enabled not only by the colonizer, but also by a global political economy of suffering and death. To make women's stories of surviving genocide visible is to risk a pornography of violence, where listeners consume the suffering of others. Against the consumption of Palestinian women's stories, stories of loss, pain, and enduring the impossible, stories, quote, spit out onto the street when done, one comes up against the frailty of the written word and the futility of simply bearing witness. While visibilizing women's stories and bearing witness to their pain and grief matters because it brings alternative knowledges and what Diane Million calls felt theory to the fore, quote, contesting dominant discourses and laying bare often invisible structures of power, bearing witness unaccompanied by taking action to end the violence and suffering and moving toward alternative forms of living and relating to each other, toward collective healing, is simply not enough. Instead, Women's stories of genocide urge us to continue to take action. They call us into intimate relation, not only in the act of bearing witness, but also in holding and accompanying them through immense pain, loss, fear, grief, and love. To do so is a call to join together in the urgent task of creating another world. Indeed, for many of us as Palestinians in this moment, we have already left the old world behind. We have already left our old selves behind, somewhere beneath the rubble, along with 40,000 or so of our people and counting. In conclusion, what is the responsibility of scholars who bear witness to mass violence? How does the unfolding of genocide necessarily transform the methods, ethics, and politics of research itself? As Palestinians surviving this moment from outside of Gaza, or from the space of Shatat, diaspora, how do we contend with the responsibility of telling the story? As a Palestinian feminist scholar, I understand telling the story of genocide in this moment to be not only a way that we make sense of the world, but also importantly, as a method of intergenerational survival. This method, bound up with our grief as Palestinians, is part of a longer arc of a Palestinian storytelling tradition that includes oral history, Nakba commemoration, and bearing witness against genocide, a tradition energized by an anti-colonial politics of preserving Palestinian memory and history against the weight of ongoing silencing, against the force of active ibadah, annihilation. In its construction as a counter-hegemonic archive of Palestinian story, Birzeit University's Institute for Women's Studies project of collecting Palestinian women's testimonies of genocide, including its choices regarding modes of storytelling, resists the model of consumption and appropriation. The stories of Palestinian women surviving genocide bring into sharp focus that there is an invisible war being waged on Palestinian sexualities, reproductive and life-giving capacities. Yet, they also compel us to understand that an analysis of reproductive genocide must go beyond the reproductive autonomy and life-giving capacities of Indigenous women. Israel's annihilatory project in Gaza and beyond is centrally one that aims to prevent the intergenerational possibility of Palestinian life in our homeland. In other words, the Zionist state's persistent and targeted efforts to diminish the life-giving capacities of Palestinians are intimately intertwined with the attempted destruction and contamination of Palestinian land and life-sustaining ecologies, including, quote, the annihilation of our agricultural and food infrastructures, the degradation of our water and air through mass weapons bombardment, and the exposure of our communities to toxic waste, chemical weapons, and hazardous environments that will have long-term effects on the health of future generations and the livability of Gaza. In short, the invasion of our bodies, sexualities, and life-giving capacities as Indigenous people are strategic and interconnected with the invasion and occupation of our homeland and its capacity to sustain Palestinian life and our future generations. Even as the Israeli state's intensification of genocide in Gaza in this moment is revealing, once again, that gender and sexual logics are not peripheral, but are central to the Zionist project, feminist movement has failed to intervene. In fact, hegemonic Western liberal feminism has again been complicit in the attempted annihilation of an Indigenous people, not only through the endorsement of military aid that kills us and attempts to disappear us, but also in the fabrication and circulation of the most egregious racialized and sexualized narratives that criminalize and pathologize our people. The failure of colonial feminism in this moment invites a reinvigorated anti-colonial feminist politics that affirms Palestinian life and alternative futures across the globe. Indeed, the Zionist targeting of the reproductive capacities of Palestinians is an extension of broader European and US colonial, white supremacist and racial capitalist strategies that seek to control the bodies of people of color and people of the global South in the service of white capital. In the US, for example, the interconnected systems of policing and prisons, settler colonialism, and migrant detentions and deportations strive to undermine the capacity of Black, Indigenous, and people of color communities to control our bodies and to parent, nurture, and protect loved ones communities, and our lands. This is why we need to strive for a reproductive justice politics that is not only anti-Zionist, but is also anti-imperialist and abolitionist, and led by the fierce power and wisdom of Indigenous and people of color communities across the globe who have been responsible for the labor of mothering and caregiving in the face of many interconnected systems of US and European empire building. As Indigenous feminists, we must seek to protect human and more than human life, even as we grieve the immensity of its loss in Gaza. Returning to the testimony of Bara, with whose words I open this essay, further illustrates the shared affective landscapes that bind us together as Palestinians and those who have joined our struggle for liberation in the ongoing witnessing of and attempts to interrupt ongoing colonial genocide. Then she writes, quote, "I weep not pain but loss. We all feel numb now. Our real pain begins the moment a ceasefire is announced. Only then will I allow myself to weep bitterly for those my heart has lost. I will weep for my two aunts and their families, my cousins, their children, and the rest of my relatives, colleagues, friends, and acquaintances. I will weep for teachers who educated me and helped shape who I am today. I will weep for my destroyed home, my lost memories, and my crushed dreams. I will curse an occupation set to raze every place I have ever called home that harbored my dreams and memories. I am left without any belongings of my own. My childhood home was demolished years back, and our current home was destroyed in this war. Even if it was mere stone, this loss weighs heavily on me, unbearable. Those stones housed my memories, laughter, dreams, and hopes. Those walls stood witness and keeper of my achievements, my certificates, and my honors, hard earned through my blood, sweat, and tears. I will weep for my beautiful city, her sea, sky, children, women, and men, young and old. I will weep both for her splendor and her destruction, her ruins and towers, her institutions, universities, and streets. I will weep for her fortitude, defiance, and the indomitable spirit of her people. The refrain of Bara's words, "I will weep," urge us to reckon with all that we have lost, to grieve all that has already been left behind in Gaza, along with the knowledge that justice for Palestinian women requires a broader reckoning with colonial wounds in the protection of Indigenous women's lives. Grief, as feminist scholars remind us, has been a formative part of the affective tissue of Palestinian kinship that holds us. Our struggle for liberation will not end the moment a ceasefire goes into effect, Bara reminds us, but we must also allow ourselves the space to weep. Thank you.
Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Dr. Sarah Ihmoud. Thank you for sharing with us the testimonies of some of the Palestinian women and making visible their experiences, their suffering, and their dignity in defying this invisible kind of war and the way that it has been in defying kind of to the absence of their stories in American media, global media, and the complicity of many of the all movements, feminist movement and others, in bringing any kind of light to what is happening. As somebody who is coming from Sudan, I can relate to how certain zones of conflicts are privileged over others, and how human life and human dignity and human worth in certain parts of the world is valued much more than others. So we are really grateful for sharing this with us. And I hope, I don't know what to hope for. So let's just remind everybody, for our participants on Zoom, please post your questions to the Q&A part of Zoom. And if you don't mind, share your names, and the same for for you here. There are index cards placed next to that. If you have a question, let's hold it up and we'll be able to collect these questions. And we have less than 20 minutes for us to take maybe 2 rounds of questions, more questions together.
Yeah. Okay, yes, I am going to read a couple of the questions. Apologies. I'm going to try to read folks' handwriting here, do my best. Okay, the first question, I'll read all three and then I'll try to respond the best that I can. But thank you in advance for your questions. The first question is, can you expand your comment on collective BIPOC solidarities, specifically with regard to Latinx communities in the US, as well as Puerto Rico? We have 2 Latino studies classes here today. And this is from Marisol Negron. Thank you so much for this question. We also have a question from Ria, maybe? Okay, how much you considered the misadventure of Hamas on October 7th and the suffering of women and children in Gaza? Where does the selective humanity of UN stand? Why UNICEF and the West don't see the children of Gaza? Okay, so a question about the selective humanity. And the third is from Linda Valere. How are the women in the testimonies doing today? How many women have given birth in Gaza in the past year, if there is any estimate? Thank you so much, Linda. I will start with this question actually, or these series of questions. Thank you. My colleagues at the Institute of Women's Studies, again, at Birzeit University in the occupied West Bank, began this project of collecting women's testimonies back in October 2023. And it's important to note that some of the folks whose testimonies I shared with you today are still in Gaza. Some have been evacuated, and they've maintained relationships with the Institute for Women's Studies to the degree that they possibly can. But some of them were students. Some of them were prospective students who had dreamed their entire academic lives of studying, especially women's gender and sexuality studies, who had recently received admission to the master's program at Birzeit University, and then just ready to begin their sort of intellectual lives as scholars, and were cut off from that possibility when the genocide began on October 7th. So I just want to honor and uplift those voices and those women, those scholars who are still in Gaza and who are really theorizing their own lived conditions, right? And I see my task right now, in part as a feminist scholar, as a Palestinian feminist scholar, to support them in thinking with them, right? Not in theorizing and enforcing my own theorization of violence over them, right? But in thinking with their own analyses of their lives, because these are scholars, these are young people, these are organizers who have been active in many of these issues that they are writing about for many decades. It's also important to note that that our educational institutions in Gaza and across occupied Palestinian territory have been under systematic military assault, right? There's a reason that all 12 universities in Gaza have been completely destroyed, right? There's a reason that hundreds of scholars, of our colleagues, right? We're in an academic institution. It's important to speak about this. Hundreds of our colleagues, professors, faculty members have been murdered by Israeli airstrikes over the past year, right? Thousands of university students have been murdered by the Israeli military. Why is the Israeli military systematically targeting Palestinian educational institutions, educators, and students? Because this attack on indigenous knowledge systems has always been a central imperative of any settler colonial movement, right? In order to attempt to destroy and eliminate an indigenous people, one has to attack their very ability to remember their histories, right? Their ability to maintain a sense of their identities as indigenous people, right? So this is part of the genocidal fabric, the assault on indigenous knowledge systems. And I want to underscore that. It's also important to note that right? My very colleagues who started this project at Birzeit University in the occupied West Bank are also under significant attack by both military actors and the state. Birzeit University's campus is systematically invaded and shut down by the military, right? Imagine UMass Boston, our campus here, being invaded by military and shut down, classes being canceled, young people not being able to reach their classes or the university because of the installation of additional checkpoints and barriers, right? And thousands of student leaders and student activists actually being arrested and detained by Israeli military forces. This is the reality our colleagues are facing, not only in Gaza, but across Palestine. And this is a reality that we must contend with as scholars as well. So choosing to focus on this particular project is not only a choice to help uplift the testimonies and the analyses being theorized by women themselves on the ground, but it's also a part of a feminist praxis to support my colleagues in occupied territory, right, who are under direct military assault. So this is a long-winded answer to part of this question, right? I don't have a complete estimate of the birth rate, unfortunately, because, right, the reality is that because of the targeted destruction of medical infrastructure in Gaza, we just don't have the statistics right now. But we do have the estimate that, right, 5,500 women are set to give birth each month, but that they're facing, right, increasing and extremely diminishing life chances, right, for themselves and for their babies. So this is the reality. Regarding the selective humanity directed toward the children of Gaza, right? Why is it that indigenous children are being targeted on a mass scale? This is also part of the genocidal politics of the Israeli state, right? Because to target the children of an indigenous people is to necessarily target an indigenous people's prospect for having a future on their homeland, right? The children of Gaza are our future. And this is precisely why they are being targeted. And we've heard the testimonies from medical professionals recently, right, who have returned from working in the hospitals, from working on the ground, and they have testified to the fact that, right, they were seeing cases of children being shot in the head, right, targeted in the head by Israeli military forces on a consistent basis, right? So these are not accidental sort of attacks on children. We know that, again, an estimate by Save the Children International, that there are, right, over 24,000 children who are still potentially buried under the rubble or missing or unaccompanied, right, who are left to fend for themselves right now within this context. So contending with the West's selective humanity and even recognizing Palestinian children as being children, right, is something that we absolutely must contend with. The feminist scholar Nadra Shalhoub-Kevorkian has coined a term to help us think with, as feminist scholars, what is happening in this situation. She's called it unchilding, right? How can we consider the ways that indigenous children, not just in Palestine, but in other social contexts, are actually stripped of their childhood as a part of this process of stripping the humanity of indigenous people? So I think this is an absolutely critical question. Thank you. Yes.
We have about 5 minutes.
Oh, my goodness. Okay.
We do have 2 questions on
Yes.
Zoom. Emily, can you please read the Zoom questions and
Yes.
see if you could lump some of them?
Oh, yes.
We do have 2 questions. We have one from Rodrigo Monterrey, who said, is it possible in condition it appears that we are often listening. Their question is, what can we do outside of donations to alleviate some of these issues?
Great, thank you for those questions. And I'm just going to read the last remaining questions that I have here, and I'll try my best, but we can continue the conversation after the talk closes. The first question is from Jose. In your piece, Ressa, the lump in one's throat, you speak to using decolonial love and healing as a vehicle conduit to engage in feminist critical consciousness. Can you please elaborate on that? Great question. Thank you so much, Jose. A lot of your work focuses on Palestinian love. Do you think the mainstream discussions around Palestine could benefit from the decentering of suffering and victimhood? Thank you for this question. And when there is a problem of this magnitude, I look for the money. The US is responsible. How do we end this war with US continued support in funding this genocide? These are all excellent questions. I wish I had more time up here to speak to them. But I think it is important, right? This is an election day. We're hearing about these issues constantly. The US is currently funding a genocide, right? It's important to underscore. And I think, right, a lot of folks in this room are thinking about the fact that this is not just an Israeli war, this is a US war, right? And our student leaders, our student activists are really leading the way on the ground right now in the space of the United States and across the globe in demanding an end to this genocide, in putting their bodies and their lives on the line in many cases. And we've seen the escalated, militarized police and, right, sort of authoritarian results or assaults on our students, on our faculty who are attempting to intervene and interrupt this genocide from the space of the US Academy in, right, this recognition that the US is directly responsible and all of our academic institutions that are invested in Israeli military, right, companies are also complicit. So I want to just applaud any student activists who might be in the room who are already involved in this issue, to encourage folks to get involved at whatever level that they can. We can talk more after the talk about how one might get involved if you're interested in speaking more. And sure how to end. There are so many good questions, but this is really important in terms of Gaza, the lump in one's throat, and the idea of using decolonial love as a vehicle toward engaging feminist critical consciousness. I think one of the things that I'm trying to do with this and in theorizing with women's stories is to invite all of you to not only bear witness, but to come into intimate relation with the women of Gaza, right? And that is the invitation here that I want to leave you with. To think with the stories that you heard today, to think with how you feel and the feelings that they brought up for you, and to not be complicit bystanders or consumers of genocidal violence or the stories of genocidal violence, but to take action in whatever capacity that you can. This is the practice of feminism, right? This is what feminism is all about. And I thank the consortium once again for inviting me to speak to you on these issues. Thank you all so much.
Thank you so much. Yeah, no, we really appreciate having you here, Sarah, Dr. Ihmoud. And so on behalf of the consortium, the intern, the UMass community, we're really grateful for your lecture and your presence. Two housekeeping stuff. We have the feedback on your chairs for those who are in the room. Please make sure that you fill the feedback. And also for our Zoom audience, a feedback must have been popped by this time. Please take the time to fill these. They are very useful for us. Also, just for those of you who haven't voted yet, make sure that you vote today. And thank you everybody. We really appreciate having you. There is the info about our next lecture as well. Make sure that you join us. Thank you so much, everybody. Appreciate having you.